John Bolton, former U.S. National Security Advisor, welcome to النهار. Your Excellency, the cycle of violence that began with the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy compound on April 1st appears to be over, at least for this round. From your perspective regarding the Middle East situation, do you believe that the risk of a broader clash between Iran and Israel have decreased?
Well, I think the overall war that Iran launched through Hamas on October the 7th obviously continues. And I think that it was part of the Iranian ring of fire strategy that they've been working on for several years. It's not just Hamas in the Gaza Strip, it's the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria, the conventional forces of Iran itself. So I think what Iran had in mind when it launched 320 drones and missiles against Israel remains unclear. But the fact that Israel didn't really retaliate in any significant way, I think, indicates that they had other priorities on their mind. I think Hamas being number one. So I think whatever the explanation for Iran's initial reaction or Israel's retaliation, it's been put on the back burner, but it's certainly not over.
Mhm, mhm. And what's your assessment to this to that first confrontation, direct confrontation between the two sides after years of shadow war? Do you see a winner and a loser?
Well, I think Israel made a mistake by not retaliating more strongly. But I do think that there's no doubt now that you've had overt action starting on the territory of both parties against the territory of the other parties. So, as you say, it's been in the shadows before, but now that line is crossed. Whether it's one rocket or 100 rockets or whatever it may be, there have been overt attacks. I think that Israel should have taken a stronger response because I think Iran may be overextended at the moment. And its proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis, seeing what's happening to Hamas and what, as we speak, may happen to finish Hamas off, is they're worried about Iran's capacity to protect them. And I think a more significant strike against Iranian territory would have put that capacity on Iran's part in doubt and may have led the Houthis and Hezbollah to back off somewhat. But that's history now. I think the next step, for all that we can see, is that Israel will try to put an end to Hamas's military and political structures in Gaza in the next days.
Are you suggesting that Iran wins the first round of confrontation between direct confrontation between the two sides, since you are saying that Israel didn't respond correctly?
Well, I think that's the consequence. I think the reason Israel didn't respond more strongly was the Biden administration was putting intense pressure on them not to do so, because from the Biden administration point of view, this whole conflict in the Middle East has a negative political implication for them in the US with our presidential elections in November. And I think the White House feared that if the conflict grew more violent, that would hurt them even more. So I think this is a temporary reprieve for Iran, but I think from Israel's point of view, they would have been better advised to take advantage of what Iran had done rather than to succumb to the pressure. But it's easy for me to say because I wasn't feeling the pressure that I think the Israeli government felt.
Mhm. You tend to describe what's happening in the Middle East as the Iranian ring of fire. Are you suggesting that Iran was behind or was responsible for the October 7th attacks?
Well, I don't think there can be any question about it. I don't think Iran for decades has armed and equipped and trained and financed these terrorist proxies to allow them what they wanted to do on their own terms. That may not mean that Iran has command and control directly over Hamas or Hezbollah, but Iran did not spend the money that it did to give Hamas the capabilities militarily that it has, simply for Hamas to use them at its own discretion. This was part of an overall strategy. In fact, I think it's not working out so well for Iran in the big picture because Hamas is close to being destroyed. But I think this was a concerted plan. The exact objective of this phase of the Ring of Fire, I don't think we can tell from the outside, but I do think it was consistent with Iran's overall aspirations in the region, which is hegemony over the Middle East and hegemony within Islam.
And how do you assess the Hezbollah participation in the conflict since October 7th attacks?
Well, the level of combat between Hezbollah and Israel has not approached that of Hamas and Israel, but it's pretty intense if you're an Israeli who lived within 5 kilometers of the blue line. That's for sure, because you've been evacuated from your home. So I think it suits both Israel and Hezbollah, for different reasons, obviously, not to bring this to the kind of confrontation we saw in 2006. But I don't think that's far away. And if Hamas is really thoroughly defeated here in the next days in the Gaza Strip, then I think both Hezbollah and Israel will have to face the question, do they now turn against each other? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think from Israel's point of view, it might be a very tempting thing to do.
Since you are talking about Gaza in the next days, are we going to a Rafah invasion or to a hostage deal and a ceasefire, in your opinion?
Well, I think the hostage deal and the ceasefire are very unlikely at this point, most significantly because I think it's very doubtful, sad to say, how many hostages are left alive. People talk about 120, 130. Realistic estimates are much below that. I've heard from Israeli sources that there may be less than 20 Israeli hostages left alive, which means that Hamas has been negotiating in bad faith for weeks now, saying it even had 40 hostages. In fact, they said they only had 27 that were either women or children or men who were elderly or injured. So that's not even 40, which they had been talking about, and certainly a long way from 120 or 130. So as we see Israel trying to clear Gazans out of eastern Rafah, I think this is an effort that the U.S. has been pressing for to help minimize the potential for civilian casualties. And I can't think of any reason to do that unless Israel was moving ahead with what they've indicated they were going to do for months now, which is go after Yahya Sinwar and the last 4 combat battalions Hamas has underneath in the tunnels underneath Rafah.
You have wrote in the Telegraph that history will record Biden's obsessive efforts to negotiate with the Ayatollah as one of the biggest self-inflicted wounds. Which wounds do you blame for the Biden administration for?
Well, any time in this case Israel delays its offensive against what's left of Hamas underneath Rafah, it gives the Hamas a greater chance to dig in, gives them greater opportunities to work escape tunnels into Egypt or somehow out of Gaza. You know, the lesson of history, starting with Alexander the Great, going to Julius Caesar, right down to the present, is when you're ready to attack, attack. Speed favors the offensive and delay favors the defender. And because of this enormous American pressure on Israel, it has delayed and delayed and delayed. And that will cost them higher casualties of their young men and women in the Israeli Defense Forces. It will make things more difficult for civilians in Gaza. But I think this is what Israel's committed to. This is not just Bibi Netanyahu. It's the entire war cabinet. They said it right after October the 7th. I think they believe it. They want the destruction of Hamas's military and political structures.
But there is also 1.7 million civilians trapped in Rafah. A ground invasion would be very heavy, would end with very heavy casualties.
Well, I think everybody wants to avoid that, maybe everybody except Hamas, because that's their strategy, to be more brutal and more barbaric than anybody else on the game. They are the ones morally culpable for the damage that's been inflicted on Gazan civilians. But there are other options nobody talks about. How about Egypt opening its borders to allow Gazan citizens to come into Egypt and get out of the Gaza Strip entirely? Egypt has said, we're not going to do that. And everybody says, well, okay, if that's what Egypt wants, we'll just agree to it. I don't know why that's true. These are people who are seeking refugees from a war zone, and Egypt's saying, no, you can't come in. So let's ask Egypt really to reconsider. And second, when a government is defeated in war, when it's the end of the government is foreseeable, as it is for Hamas here, one thing they could do is surrender. So Yahya Sinwar could say, look, we've been defeated. I don't want to cause any more human tragedy in Gaza. Hamas surrenders. How about that as an alternative? Instead, everybody's saying, in effect, Israel should surrender and allow Hamas to continue, this terrorist group which committed the most barbaric assault we've seen, I think, really since World War II and the Holocaust against the Jews in Europe. But nobody seems to take that into account, and I think that this is a conflict that was caused by Hamas and could be ended by Hamas surrendering. So why isn't there pressure on Hamas to surrender?
My last question, given your prior caution regarding the next months, you said that they are very challenging leading up to the US presidential election. What do you anticipate as the probable course of action for Iran in the region and via the US?
Well, I think we don't know because, as I said earlier, we don't know exactly what Iran's near-term objectives were with the October 7 attack by Hamas. My general view is that it's not going well for Iran, all things considered. Losing Hamas, losing their investment in Hamas is going to be a significant setback for Iran. Is it willing to raise the stakes and launch Hezbollah against Israel? Is it ready to make further direct attacks on Israeli territory? We don't know. But it's a dangerous situation in any case, with a lot of actors who are unpredictable and erratic, and not necessarily a situation that will lead to stability anytime soon.
What are your expectations for the northern front, our southern front, and Israeli northern front with Hezbollah?
Well, I helped draft the resolution in 2006 that ended the Israel conflict with Hezbollah. Then Hezbollah's violated it almost before the ink was dry. They've inflicted terrible suffering on the Lebanese people. Now they're inflicting suffering in Syria. These terrorist groups contribute nothing to the advance of civilization. They are threats to everybody who comes within their reach. And someday they're going to have to be dealt with. Now, whether Israel's prepared to do that after it finishes Hamas, I certainly don't know. But the day will come when Hezbollah and its 120 to 150,000 missiles in Lebanon is going to have to be eliminated as the threat that it is.
It's always great to talk to you. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.